Good day, everyone. Welcome to our Waiting Theological Roundtable, our roundtable for this Holy Saturday. As you have heard through our other roundtables, I am Gordon Rankin, the conference minister serving the New Hampshire Conference of the United Church of Christ. And this is the seventh in our series of Holy Week Theological Roundtables being produced by the New Hampshire Conference. These roundtables will be sent out daily via our conference weekly news and also posted daily on our conference Facebook page, starting on Palm Sunday and going through Easter. They're also available on our conference website, and I've actually been telling you in the last couple of days the more difficult way to find them. If you scroll down on the conference website towards the bottom of the page, there's a big link that says Holy Week Resources. You click on that, you're right there. That's the simple way to find them. And they're also available on the New Hampshire Conference YouTube channel. The intent of our roundtables is to provide a little extra content of inspiration during what we know is going to be a rather unusual and different Holy Week for us all. So with the understanding of how we will be using these roundtables, I need to turn to our panel for the day and ask you to confirm your willingness to allow your words and wisdom to be shared among our churches in this way.
Okay.
Good with me.
Very good, thank you. So now that we've got your agreement, I guess I can introduce you because you're allowed to share things with us. So let me start by introducing the Reverend Gina Finocchiaro, pastor at the First Congregational Church, United Church of Christ in Wolfeboro, who also serves as the community chaplain for Brewster Academy.
Hi there, good to be with you.
Next, I would like to introduce the Reverend Dawn Berry, who, like so many of our quote-unquote retired clergy, finds new ways to serve the church. Dawn currently serves as the chair of the New Hampshire Conference's Racial Justice Mission Group.
Hi, good to be with you.
And I would like to introduce to you the Reverend Richard Slater, who is the Associate Conference Minister for the New Hampshire Conference of the United Church of Christ.
Good morning. Good to be with you all.
And so our topic today comes from what little we know of the Holy Saturday story. And so we step into this topic of waiting with one very brief little scripture, which comes from the Gospel of Luke, the 23rd chapter, and it's just 3 small verses, verses 54 through 56. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. They returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath day, they rested according to the commandment. So I am going to just have us jump right into the heart of my wonderings about this Holy Day Saturday. I kind of imagine this as a movie where, you have the crucifixion and the entombment, and you fade to black, and then the movie fades back up at the sunrise on Sunday morning. And I'm left with the big wondering, why did resurrection have to wait? I understand Jesus having said that the resurrection would happen on the 3rd day. But wouldn't it have been more impactful if Jesus had just been taken off the cross and then in front of everyone immediately jumped up and said, "Good try, I'm here, I'm back"? How does this delay serve the story? How does it serve to make God's point? Why did resurrection have to wait?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is that in order to understand that Jesus was fully human, we also have to understand the reality of death. And that the people needed to pause, they needed to absorb what had happened, the horror of it. the separation that they felt from Jesus, the absence of Jesus, and they needed that time. Otherwise, it would have been, I guess, a Superman story rather than the gospel story.
You know, I think for me, the question that's embedded within the question is what happens during the 3 days, during the waiting? What happens between Jesus dying a real death and the resurrection moment? Which is a question I think I have been fascinated with for a long time. So I was particularly intrigued to read one of John Dominic Crossan's new books that he put out with his wife a couple of years ago called Resurrecting Easter, that talks about the Eastern belief of universal resurrection. So the Crossans make a case through art and architecture and a 7-year pilgrimage around the world to study and understand art, that they find that during that time, that's when the story that is not written in the Gospels and is less of a part of our Western tradition of Jesus descending into hell to gathering people up. And I think the Crossans make a convincing argument that the universal part of resurrection is what gets accomplished in the 3 days of waiting. That Jesus goes to gather everybody up, that Jesus's resurrection is not just for Jesus, but for all of us. That has significantly shaped my grappling with the empty waiting of the time in between the crucifixion and Easter morning.
Actually, in the Apostles' Creed, in our tradition, it says he suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead.
Right.
That's that whole, and that comes from the first letter of Peter also, this understanding of, right, reaching down and going to that place where people thought there was no God, to
Right.
that place of death.
To be
My thoughts.
resurrected for us all. Oh, sorry, Richard, go ahead.
Sorry. My thoughts went in a slightly different fashion. I think my thinking is that the experience of death, and there's a wide variety of experiences of the death of a loved one, but it is, I think, always a thin place. For better or for worse, one is closely connected to one's values, beliefs in God. And it feels that in this moment that God needs to come near, and in the silence of the Sabbath, we become better prepared to absorb all that this death means. So I tend to think of this moment as a holy moment, a thin place for them and for us as we experience Holy Week.
And what each of you offered, one of the things I wanted to pick up and just go a little deeper on is where Dawn started us off, is the grieving piece essential to the story. Which is part of what I took Dawn saying. That's why I'm asking the question.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think that my hesitation is simply, I don't think the story is trying to suggest that the grieving begins and ends in the 3 days in between.
That's right. Right. In the story, yeah, it is the 3 days, the death, the burial, and then the resurrection. In life, that period, that Saturday is a metaphor maybe for a longer period, as people come to terms with absence and loss, and then begin to experience presence in a new way. I was reading in Kelly Brown's book, Stand Your Ground, about Trayvon Martin's parents. And what happened to them is that after the horrific murder of their son and the acquittal of the person who shot him, claiming stand your ground laws, they found that during that time, it was the recalling to memory, first painfully, but then to remember their son in a way that was different from the way he was being portrayed on television. To remember who he truly was for them kind of that Saturday time. Mm-hmm. Kelly likens that remembering to a resurrection, but we're talking about that Saturday time and the ability to begin to hold those memories, painful, but then also joyful in a way, because it brings the person back to us. I just found that a very poignant understanding from Brown's book.
Yeah, I mean, I think the in-between time is a time of reconnecting too, right? Whether we are imagining a gospel story or we're imagining deaths that we have experienced in our own circles and communities, or in a very public family like the Browns, that in-between time. And I think that idea of universal resurrection sits well in me, because it's a time for the reconnecting of those of us who are still here on earth to decide what will the lasting remembrance be? How do we make sense of what is to come? What will the initial glimmers of resurrection begin to look like? But it's a time of a community drawing back together, of reconnecting person to person, family to family, community members. You know, there's always that time. I think one of the things I worry about in the middle of this mess we're in is there's always that time between when someone dies and we get to some kind of ritual celebration of their passing, and there's sometimes a short amount of time and sometimes an extensive amount of time in between that always feels, for a community and a family, unsettled, because there hasn't been the closure of a celebration or a service. That's that kind of Holy Saturday waiting. It's both less intense perhaps than the dying or the anticipation of the dying in those circumstances, and yet not quite into the, okay, what's this new life gonna look like? And that's certainly, for today and for the moment that we're all living through, is exactly what this feels like, that kind of Holy Saturday of waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And the question of grieving brings to my mind the idea that grieving is always a journey, and it's a journey that that once embarked upon doesn't really have an end to it. And for the Christian community, the followers, the disciples community, they are really embarking upon a journey from defeat to victory, from fear to confidence, from failure to the establishment of a new people on the way. That is, they were called people of the way. And so it reminds us that a journey has begun in these waiting moments, a journey that began in grief.
Mm-hmm.
So one more question along these lines. We all know that we're in a time filled with many griefs right at this moment in human history. And I think that our faith would say to all of us that there will come a time of new life. Now, we can't put a date on that yet, but our faith leads us to believe that not only will we celebrate Easter on the date the Christian calendar assigns, but we will celebrate an Easter, a time of new life at the end of this time of grief that we're going through as well. And just to hear you talk, I'm wondering, do we yet have a picture of what we'll be remembering in the Holy Saturday part of this journey? And no's an okay answer.
I think that's one of the questions that we should hold centrally. What do we, what are the things that we want to remember about how we've lived these times? What are the lessons that we've learned, the griefs that we can name, the things that were hard or the things that were a relief? Certainly I have heard folks share, oh, what a relief. I don't have to do this thing. Not all of the things that have been canceled or postponed have people experienced as bad. You know, but I think as we settle into this being a longer time, a marathon and not a sprint, one of the questions for each of us and for all of us is, how do we live with purpose this time and not just wish it away or pretend it's not happening or settle into the despair of it? Are there gifts in this time?
I like the word living with purpose, because I think that's also an outcome of a grieving process, that you have to find that new purpose. You have to make sense. You have to make meaning, I think is a better word. And purpose does that. You know, though, I'm thinking that most of religious life is lived in Saturday waiting. Because as I do racial justice work, that new life, there's glimmers, there's sprouts of green, there's good things that happen, but it's not where it needs to be. It's not that new kingdom of God. And there's still crucifixions, deaths that happen. And I feel like in our work, in ministry, that we're living in this Saturday, this waiting. And this is the time we have to find our purpose. What are we about? What are we really going to proclaim? Keep people just comfortable? Will it be like 9/11 where the churches were filled and then months down the road when it was back to normal, everybody was worried about going to the gym, you know, raising money, having their kids really achieve? We're in this Saturday of waiting. And I think that the word waiting biblically also means hope. That's what keeps us going in this Saturday of in-between times. When I think of those who wait upon the Lord, they shall rise up with the wings of eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not be faint. That waiting is, if translated in some translations, is hope. Those who hope in God. And so it's more than a day to find hope, I think. But that's also what grieving and Saturday's about. Hope enough that we can live a purpose. Hope enough that we live a purpose that no matter what happens, our church, our people, our communities make a difference in the world. That we proclaim the gospel in ways that are just alive and not just some stale ritual.
There's a Carrie Newcomer song, The Beautiful Not Yet, which is what I just kept thinking about while you were talking, Dawn. Beautiful Not Yet.
So everyone, you can pause the video and go listen to the song and come back and join us in a few moments.
I'd like to hear it.
So Richard earlier mentioned the idea of Sabbath. And in the scriptural narrative, that's the piece that's presented for the delay, is that the women are keeping Sabbath. So it seems like we should take a moment to pause and talk about Sabbath. How do you understand Sabbath, and how does it impact your ministry and faithfulness?
I tend to think of Sabbath as recreation, separating the two. So it's not recreation as we understand it, but kind of recreation, stepping out of the kind of the urgent that so drive our lives, to think. And here I'm, of course, echoing Nouwen's writing, but stepping out of the urgent in order that we might connect with the important things in life. It's an intentional, restful time, and among the many things we are called to do in the scriptures, it's probably the most challenging thing to actually do and do well. But I do think of it as recreation.
So we were talking a few moments ago about the idea of that Holy Saturday is not our only time of waiting in our experiences of faithfulness. And this certainly resonates with me. I know that I don't think I have ever had a sense of call developing where there isn't some big components of waiting as that happens. At times to my own frustration, because I want things to be clearer or quicker. And at the same time, I know there are probably plenty of times that I also end up leaving God waiting on me. So it's mutual. How do we understand waiting as a spiritual concept, perhaps even a spiritual discipline? What does it mean for your faith, and what does it mean for your relationship with God?
I'll jump in maybe a little bit to both the last question and this one. So I always think waiting is hard, and I think Sabbath is hard. I think perhaps clergy do Sabbath more poorly than other people do Sabbath. You know, for me, it requires both intention and practice, with permission that I don't have to do it the same way every time. But I remember there's a line that Craig Barnes wrote in a Christian Century article a few years ago that has kind of stuck with me and resonated. And he says, the world as we know it is always a thread away from unraveling. It feels like we're living that at the moment. This notion that there are lessons. This is an opportunity about slowing down, which is one of the things I think waiting offers us as a gift, to slow down. Richard, I think, was talking a little bit about that. We've been functioning in this kind of instant gratification culture, and these days of extreme social distancing and COVID-19 has made that impossible in many ways. We no longer can get whatever it is we want as fast as we want it, or we used to be able to get it. There's this unraveling in a way. So for me, in the waiting, when I'm doing it well, it's taking time to breathe and pray, and for me, cook and bake. The practice of both being centered in the moment and also allowing myself to be distracted from the waiting, to quell the anxiety.
The other day I went to Trader Joe's. This was maybe 10 days ago to get some groceries. And Trader Joe's had just implemented its policy of waiting. We were separated by tapes on the on the sidewalk as we came in, and the line wrapped around the building. And as I walked toward the store from the parking lot and got in line, I found myself saying, I am not ready to wait. I don't have my material. I don't have reading material. In other words, like so many, waiting isn't a natural function. And I have to, like so many people, think about how I'm going to use the time. And I would echo what Gina was just saying, is that as a culture, we're not very good at waiting for a line or for justice. Thinking back to what Dawn was saying earlier, as somebody who's more closely connected to the people of Zimbabwe than I was a while back, and have visited there, I sometimes wonder how they as a people wait for good government, for a government that will begin to act on behalf of the people rather than acting on behalf of those in power. And I don't know how they wait. I don't know why there hasn't been an uprising and a revolt. I certainly, in America, we would never put up with what they put up with in the context of waiting for justice to come.
And yet it seems like we have our own version of it, of waiting for justice. And I think there have been a number of things in recent times where, how long, oh God? You know, we can say, you know, I think the other way to frame it is waiting for justice, or in this Easter moment, it's waiting for resurrection.
Mm-hmm. For me, waiting is always a time. I'm impatient. As I grow older, I'm gaining some patience, but probably not as much as I really should have. I think it's one of the virtues, isn't it? Patience, one of the fruits of the Spirit. But I discover about myself in waiting, I learn what it is I can control. And usually it's only myself. And then what I can't control, and I have to let go, and I have to give over to God. And those are hard lessons because you're right, we do live in a culture, and I certainly absorb that culture of wanting instant gratification. Send out an email, I want to reply. You know, I want to know. And it's hard to wait. And yet it is, I think, spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. And it has a lot to do with trust.
So you know you're having a good UCC theological conversation when you invoke a Trader Joe's parable. We've all kind of mentioned thus far in the conversation how challenging waiting can be. And the fact that I think we've generally all admitted in some way that we do it imperfectly. And perhaps at times are impatient with it. For those who are listening, who are feeling the challenging of waiting right now, are there things that you do that help you be still before God and be more patient with the waiting? Or are there things we can offer to others who are wondering how they do that in this moment?
Getting outside, I guess, walking my dog, listening to the sound of the birds now as they're starting to sing more. That's helpful.
Yeah, living in the moment.
Being in the moment.
Yeah.
Not trying to think too far ahead.
Yeah.
Turning off the news.
And the social media.
Mm-hmm.
I have heard myself say to my friends on regular occasion, I need to just stop reading Facebook, or at least take a break and only read it. Certainly not before bed. kind of limiting the assault of bad news that's coming in. I sort of jumped ahead, but for me, it's keeping busy in a different way. So in ways that are productive, that I have control over, how do I use this time of waiting? But at the end of the day, for me, it's always, I just come back to my breath and breathe, which sounds so simple and somewhat foolish, but it's that natural rhythm of life where all I have to focus on is taking in oxygen and expelling carbon dioxide, to just bring it back.
One of the other things that I guess I learned this about 8 years ago when I had stage 2 cancer, and it was practicing gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, seriously practicing gratitude. Instead of looking at things like why me, or thinking ahead, you know, making things much more worse than they could be. Staying again in the moment and naming what I'm grateful for. And that's been a practice that's kept me, I think.
So if I'm listening to you all well, it seems like one direct correlation here with patient waiting is a connection between patient waiting and mindfulness.
Yeah, the Jesuits have a nice practice called the examen.
Mm-hmm.
And at the heart of the examen is a reflection on the day with gratitude, looking and naming the various small ways in which God has touched your life over the course of the day.
Mm-hmm.
It's more than, I think it's more than mindfulness, although mindfulness is a part of it. It's endeavoring to see the connections between God and self over the course of a period of time.
One of the new practices I have been practicing is the practice of savoring, which is a practice of being in the moment, but to really be present in my cup of tea, or in the raspberries that I had, or in the glory of the sunshine and being outside, and really experiencing that present moment. Is very Wendell Berry in the way that you observe the world before you, in a way of being present. There's been good psychological science about how savoring helps us actually to be more joyful, to be more present. So savoring as a spiritual practice. Gratitude is certainly part of that, but yeah.
Is it safe to say, particularly as we think about Holy Saturday, that part of that being present to that savoring is also being present to the grief of the moment?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah, I think in the complexity of what joy means, joy is not just happiness, but to be truly joyful, it's to also recognize the grief that is present in joy. And so being exquisitely present to the grief of the moment is a way of savoring a moment, or being fully in it and being joyful. The quest of a spiritual person is not to be happy. Happiness is not one of the fruits of the spirit, but joy is, and one can only know authentic joy if one also knows authentic grief.
I was not always a fan of the theologian Bultmann, but he did have a definition of joy that has always stuck with me. Joy is the act of faith that overcomes sorrow. I think that's what you're saying, Gina.
Yep.
So I have one more place I'd like to take our conversation, but before I do, I know, Dawn, you were particularly interested in our conversation today because you felt that it definitely tied with some of the racial justice work you've been doing. And so I just want to pause and ask, do you have a direction you'd like us to take our conversation relative to that?
Well, I think when I talked about how ministry in areas of justice, we're living in Saturday, the Saturday of waiting. I guess we've covered some of that, but we just touched briefly on the part, waiting is trusting God, but I liked, someone said, it's also God trusting us. How God waits upon us to be the voice for those whose voices are not heard. How God trusts us to interrupt those acts of racism. How God trusts us to interrupt the microaggressions, that hurtful language that we often use with people in our congregations who are people of color, without even thinking, without even meaning to, because we don't appreciate a culture, or we live in a stereotype. So I guess that's part of what I think God is trusting us to begin to, I don't particularly like this word, but I don't have a better one for it, to decolonize the church. That's what Dr.
I like the word, so you have permission to say it.
Well, Dawn, maybe we just use the word resurrection, right? To kind of practice resurrection. I think for me, that's part of the good news of the resurrection, even in the gospel story, taking 3 days. It doesn't have to happen instantaneously. It doesn't happen instantaneously. I feel like in that there's room for me to find my courage to use my voice, to find the ways where I have power that I can use in a right and just way. That it isn't, oh, you missed the moment and it's gone. But it is, in this almost Easter season, there are acts of practicing resurrection, which I often come back to on Easter. It's not a one and done moment. We have to each embrace it. And so decolonize is not a bad word, but isn't it practicing resurrection and owning that it's good news for all of us, not just those of us in privileged positions, that it's the work for all of us to do together, that Jesus goes first, but makes room for all of us to also practice resurrection.
Right. I think it would be my hope that all the churches would undergo the process for becoming a racial justice church. That's a very tangible thing to do. But I think it has to do with each of us beginning to step out of our safe places and explore some new understandings and some new ground. And to understand that none of us are free until we all are free. That's kind of the understanding of the universal resurrection, isn't it?
Right.
Isn't that what Peter said? Don't think God is slow. Right. God's just waiting. God's just patient for all of you to wake up,
To do your work.
To do your work. That's right. To change,
Right.
To take this seriously.
Right.
That's what it is.
Yeah. I'm going to switch roles and be a panelist for a moment because you gave me an aha moment, Dawn. What you were talking about made me think about my time engaged in ministry with Lakota people. And my aha moment was, it just all of a sudden occurred to me that every day I spent in that connection, every conversation was Holy Saturday. It just was that time of waiting for a new hope, a justice that had yet to come. Richard talked about that a moment ago with the people of Zimbabwe, and I think this is true over and over. I mean, we could keep citing the examples. Mm-hmm. And I know in our churches at times we can get hung up on the word and term justice because it can get politicized. But part of my aha is ultimately, isn't this saying, let's bring resurrection to people who are stuck in Holy Saturday? Mm. I mean, isn't that our faith calling? And how can any of us argue against that?
I think waiting in relationship to racial justice or any form of justice can be a healthy thing if one is listening, if one is attentive to the voice of the Spirit. But it can also be an unhealthy thing. There's a very shadowy side to waiting. Mm-hmm. When people are asked to live in the context of injustice, to wait.
That's right.
That your day will come. So the church has been among those who have over the years asked people to wait for justice. And the waiting really was a delay in justice and perhaps a hope on the part of those who are asking for the waiting, a denial of justice. So I'm trusting that our waiting and our anticipation of resurrection is done in the context of or is done as a people willing to listen to the voice of God, but also to the voice of those who are suffering.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a tension that we have to hold each other accountable for. The holy righteous anger of being the people who are told to wait, who have been waiting for too long already. I found this quote that came across from a Holy Saturday sermon, and it comes from a 7th century pseudo-Athanasius of Salamis in Cyprus. And the quote is, Jesus says, "I did not create you to be held a prisoner in hell. Rise from the dead, for I am the life of the dead. Rise up, work of my hands, you who were created in my image. Rise, let us leave this place. For you are in me and I am in you, and together we form only one person, and we cannot be separated." Mm. Kind of, I think, speaks to Richard's, as long as some of us are still living as prisoners or waiting for justice, we are all still imprisoned and in hell.
Exactly.
So to draw our conversation towards a conclusion, I want to personalize this a little bit and simply ask you, where have you found the sacred? Where have you found God in the midst of your own times of waiting?
In my church community, in the acts of kindness during a time of grief, I experienced the love of God through them when I could not feel it myself. That's sometimes grief does that. You have to go through those very dark moments, those moments of being in the pit. And for me, it was the church. In so much of my life, it's been the church. So much of so much of the work that we do, whether it be in justice or in caring ministries, or if we do it alone, we burn out.
To echo a little bit what Dawn has said, I remember the first time I experienced the gift of receiving, which was overwhelming. And it has made me think differently about also when I give, because it's imbalanced. When I give, often it takes less of me than the impact of the gift of receiving does, if that makes sense. That has been enormously powerful to me in sort of the dark night of the soul moment, in the waiting Holy Saturday moments of my life. In this current moment, I have taken time each day to connect with a favorite person in my life that I've maybe fallen out of touch with. So I recently connected with a seminary classmate who has moved out to Missouri and who I haven't talked to in at least 10 years. It was such a tonic for the soul to talk with her last weekend. And this practice of trying to connect with a different person every day has made me dig deeper than the first 4 people that are on my favorites list of my contact list, maybe. So that's been a gift. So relationship, particular individual relationship. And then the other thing that is always a gift for me is getting my hands dirty and planting something, and being reminded of my place in the family of things, as Mary Oliver says. So I think one of the things I anticipate in this odd, difficult time that we're living in is I might actually get my plants planted in a reasonable time. The last few summers, I've been lucky to get my tomatoes planted by the 4th of July. And this year, they might actually get planted closer to Memorial Day, which would be enormous in my life. So getting my hands dirty.
And I would echo what Gina's saying. Yesterday, I spent some time digging in soil and beginning to think about the life of the earth, the springing forth of plants, flowers, and vegetables. That was the most renewing place. I find that this hour of waiting, so to speak, is a time that is also marked by a sense of danger, of risk. We're waiting as a family for my youngest daughter to give birth. That'll happen in a couple of weeks. I was going to say, God willing, that's going to happen in a couple of weeks. It's going to happen anyway. And so getting away from, the only way to kind of still the voices of fear and risk, I think, is to get into the mundane, to get into those places where one digs in the earth, one does things that are very connected to the God we experience in nature.
And I would just round this out by, everything you all have said. And for me, it's also just paying attention for the voice of God in the unexpected places. The confirmation class at South Church in Concord put together a video for their community, and at least by halfway through, I had tears in my eyes for the rest of the video. And it was not even so much what they said, but that I could hear the voice of God in what they said. And to pause, to be mindful, of where God is in the unexpected for me is, that is probably one of the gifts of waiting, because it's really too easy to just race through. And in the waiting, maybe we pay a little more attention to those unexpected moments of grace. Well, Dawn and Gina and Richard, I want to thank you for what has been a very powerful conversation at a level of depth that I wasn't even anticipating from writing the questions, but I think will really make folks Holy Saturday even a bit more sacred. So thank you for all that you have shared.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, and the invitation. It's good to be with all of you too.
Yeah.
I concur. Thank you all. Thank you for the conversation.
And I want to thank all our friends who have been watching our Holy Week roundtables. We have but one yet left, and that will be tomorrow on Easter Sunday, when we will discuss the resurrection story. Have a happy Holy Week.